Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast with Jonathan Rapping. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back. May. It is May already. May is Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yes.
After a year of racial reckoning and social isolation, it is more important now than ever to have a national conversation about mental health. Mm-hmm. It is estimated that in a given year, 1 in 4 American adults will suffer from a mental health disorder. Despite the prevalence of mental health issues in America, it is a topic laden with stigma, particularly in the Black and Brown communities. Predominantly Black and Brown neighborhoods are both systemically deprived of social services, including traditional health care, and more importantly, and sadly, mental health care. And often those same communities are over-policed at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people who come from economically disadvantaged communities, particularly people of color, often encounter police, judges, prosecutors, when really what they need are counselors, social workers, and addiction treatment specialists, right? Public defenders who represent 80% of the people accused of crime are often the last advocate standing between someone in need of mental health services and incarceration. So it's a great topic to discuss on this show.
And one of the things, let me just know, because sometimes when you say the percentage, 80% of the people that come to the system, folks can't really visualize that number in bodies. So that's 4 out of 5 people in this country. 4 out of 5 people are thrown into the system and they are given a public defender. And so today we are so excited to be joined by some experts in different fields. And it's interesting, this topic brings us all together. So we're so excited to be joined by Shanti Das. She's the former executive vice president and at Universal Motown Records, and now founder of the nonprofit organization Silence the Shame. Dr. Alfie Breland Noble, who we lovingly call and everyone calls Dr. Alfie, is a psychologist and founder of the nonprofit organization, the Acoma Project. And Zanelli Ingubeni, supervising attorney in the Atlanta Judicial Circuit Public Defender Office here in Atlanta, Georgia, and also Gideon's Promise faculty member and alum of the program.
Yes.
We are looking forward to enlightening this conversation on the intersection of race, justice, and mental health in America. Thank you so much, you all, for joining us.
Hello, it's a pleasure and honor to be here.
Yeah, same, definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're excited to have y'all.
So Shanti, I'm gonna start with you. During your career as a record label executive, you work with some of the biggest names in the music industry, right? From Prince, Outkast, and we're here in Atlanta, so I love Outkast. Outkast, TLC, Usher, Erykah Badu. And throughout history, music has really been the key to bringing people together, to bring communal healing, a form of expression and storytelling. But what was the shift? How did you go for it? Like your experience professionally in the music industry, how did that lead you into this space with Silence the Shame and mental health awareness?
Thanks, Ellie. That's a great question. So, my father took his own life when I was 7 months old. And we didn't talk about it as a family. My mom is African American. My dad was of Indian descent. And, it was just hush hush. You know how it was back in the 70s. You didn't tell your secrets. Nobody wanted to share. And so fast forward to my career in entertainment, I had buried and hidden a lot of those feelings. But when I started dealing with just the normal stresses of life and anxiety within a high-paced industry like the music industry, I didn't really know what to do with that trauma, right? I didn't know how to unpack it. And then when I dealt with those other emotional issues, they started manifesting into physical and more emotional health problems. And so I ended up at the height of my career in 2009, really dealing with a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. Still wasn't going to therapy. I don't know if it was my ego, or if it just was me, from a cultural perspective of being embarrassed and ashamed. But I still wasn't properly dealing with it. And so I ended up walking away at the height of my career, moved back home to Atlanta. And then in 2014, my best friend took her own life. So any other issues that I was dealing with, you just added that on. Those were just layers upon layers upon layers, right? Of a lot of emotional stress that I was dealing with. And in 2015, Illy, I came close to taking my own life. I had counted up all the pills in my medicine cabinet. And, luckily I'm here on the Gideon's Promise podcast, grateful that I got the help that I needed. But it really led me to this work. And then looking back on entertainment and so many artists and people in the industry that I've seen that suffer from depression or die by suicide, or especially, substance abuse issues, it only made sense for me to then go back, and do this work in that community. And so now Silence to Shame is, we're proud to say we do a lot of work nationally and even around the globe. And we're one of the most commonly used hashtags around mental health and wellness in this space and in the community. And that's why I just love Gideon's Promise, because of what you guys do. And I know I'll get into that a little bit more about, why the work that I do with you all matters with this work, because you talk about marginalized communities, and that's just it. We're the last ones to have the access to healthcare. We're the last ones to want to talk about therapy. So as we can continue to erase stigma in these conversations through the Gideon's Promise podcast, we're doing this work. We're opening up these circles and safe spaces and safe places to really talk about it.
Yeah, Shanti, I have to say thank you so much just for sharing with us. And I think we feel so fortunate that you've come into our lives here at Gideon's Promise. So thank you. And you've talked about our work with marginalized communities. And that really brings me, Dr. Alfie, to you, because you specialize in really working with communities that are marginalized, that have experienced trauma from all sorts of sources. And the trauma isn't just deeply ingrained in the bodies of the people in those communities, but it's sort of ingrained in the fabric of the communities in many ways. As a doctor, a psychologist who works with those communities, how do you address trauma that's so deeply ingrained?
So a couple things. I think one thing I always try to start from a place of grounding us. And, I'm like Shanti, I'm Gen X. Probably most of us are. And I can see one young face. So I know one face, one ain't no Gen X. She ain't old like us. So
she has an old soul.
There you go. We'll take that old soul. We all got young souls. We're gonna do it like that. We're gonna meet in the middle.
Yes.
But in our generation, to Shanti's point, we didn't talk about mental health. And I'm Black. I'm a chocolate girl. We definitely didn't talk about no mental health. And whatever our hue is on that Black spectrum, that's just not something that we talked about. So the idea that you would grow up, I would joke with people and say, the only representation we had, I'm not saying it was bad, but it's all we had, was Tootie, Willis and Arnold. Come on now, right? James Evans, Florida Evans, right? Like we can name them, Sanford and Son. That's kind of all we had, and until the 80s, and that wasn't necessarily fully reflective of all of our experiences. Then we got the Huxtables, let me say it like that. We got the Huxtables, and then it was sort of like a little bit more full, and then we got a different world, whoop, whoop, and it was like, okay, that's us. That's all of us. But within that, I think one of the reasons some of those shows were so important is because they would tell stories. We didn't name it racial trauma, but that's essentially what they were naming, right? So when Whitley goes to the store and the lady don't want to touch her, don't want to sell her the expensive stuff, that's a racial trauma, right? It doesn't matter how small it is or how big it is, it's still racial trauma. I know Shanti, her college education was at a predominantly white educational institution. My undergrad, I happened to be fortunate. I went to Howard, so with black on top of black, which was wonderful. It was wonderful, right? And so I was there with all these people that Shanti works with. Diddy was in my class, like all the hitmen, all those guys. And so for me, that was an oasis for 4 years. Now, there's other issues, but it certainly wasn't about me being Black. And so I think in our communities, what's also a deeply ingrained is these experiences, and you keep hitting these racial traumas, but nobody names it racial trauma. That's just life. That's just what it means to be Black or Latinx or Asian or whatever your ethnic background happens to be. It's just a part. And so I feel like what's really important is for us to recognize that there's socioeconomic diversity in our communities. There are many Black communities that are severely underserved. They have a lot of socioeconomic trauma and community violence and those other things. But on top of that, what feels really important to me is to always talk about the fullness of the Black experience. And the fullness of it is, even when you're corporate, there's trauma. Even when you got money, you still are hitting walls and experiencing these negative things, and it doesn't protect you. So for me, it's really about naming and then centering who we are as racial beings as a part of our healing process. That is deeply important to me. And I feel like that's part of what is lacking in the research and clinical work that my colleagues do. They don't want to talk about it. And so I feel like that's part of our mission with my nonprofit and me as an individual, is to put the research and the knowledge out there so that people can see themselves. My thing is always, we want to feel seen, valued, and heard. And that's what we try to do. And that's what's critical, I think, to Black and brown folks' mental health.
And so, I actually had the pleasure, because Shanti put on a webinar event a couple of months back with some other psychologists. And one of them said, call a thing, right? And I think that's what you're leading to, is that we need to call a thing. And I've heard that said a lot over this past year, with all of the things, with the protests happening, all the continuous racial trauma that you just described. Can we talk a little bit, Dr. Alfie, about not just about the intersection of race with the other quote unquote marginalized labels, right? How does the LGBTQ factor, gender diversity, people with disability, how do those intersections that deal with race, because some people have multiple check boxes, right? How do you have conversations about that as well?
It goes back, it's a wonderful question, and it goes back to exactly what you just said about calling a thing. So I think I'll give you a perfect example of how this shows up. And I think the way that it shows up is also causes injury to the psyche of people who come from these groups. So when you look at national organizations or even local organizations that focus on issues specific to, let's just stay in the area of mental health, we often ask people to choose. Either you are Black or you are LGBTQ, right? For the organizations that serve your needs, either you are disabled or you are Black, right? And I think what's rare is for people to talk about the fullness of who people are. To me, that's an injury. So when I look at organizations, I'm not going to call anybody out, but when I look at some organizations, what I see is this is an organization that advocates for the mental health needs of people with disabilities. And I don't see no color when I see them. I don't see no color in the leadership. I don't see no color in the people who are presented, right? Or I'll see LGBTQ, it's the same thing. I don't see racial ethnic diversity centered. And so I think what people are looking for is they're trying to find a place where can I just be all of who I am, and all of that is valued. Excuse me. So to me, that's what's really important. That's what happens to people. And that's just kind of one microcosm of an example. In the larger society, I think often people are asked to choose as well. So what that does is it reifies that you have these categories and you can never be a fully integrated whole. And what we really are seeking, which I think is what Silence the Shame does, that's what we try to do, that's what you all are doing with this podcast, we even asking the question, is we're trying to bring all of who you are to the center. So what I always try to tell people is who you are is valuable and it's unique, right? And we want to celebrate all aspects of who you are. And if you can celebrate that by just acknowledging all of who you are, that is the first step on the path toward what I call optimal mental health. That's helping you to move forward. If you don't acknowledge the fullness of who you are, that's sometimes where those injuries start.
Yeah. Zanelli, I want to turn to you, and I've got to say, I am so excited that you're here with us, because Zanelli, you have been rolling with Gideon's Promise literally since it started, 2007. Yeah, I remember I met you actually as a law student when I was in Georgia and you were at the University of Tennessee in 2007. Your first job out of law school was in New Orleans, and you were part of the group that helped rebuild that office after Katrina, came to New Orleans, went to Maryland after we helped launch Gideon's Promise there. You've been with us for a long time, so I'm excited to have you on the show. And one thing that I frequently try to point out to audiences is that really when it comes to marginalized communities, almost every challenge people who grow up in marginalized communities deal with, they have to deal with through the criminal legal system, right? Whether it's poor education, houselessness, substance abuse, and certainly mental health is another issue. So many people we only deal with mental health issues if you are low income in the criminal legal system. And in fact, there are studies that show that 25% of people with mental health disorders have a history of involvement with the criminal legal system. There are other studies that show 12% of people with mental health disorders only received access to mental health services after having an experience with the criminal legal system. And as a public defender, you come face to face with the criminalization of mental health every day. And I wonder if you could talk with the audience a little bit about your experience with the intersection of mental health and the criminal legal system as a public defender.
Well, thank you, Rap, so much for having me here. It is actually my honor as well to be part of any Gideon's Promise broadcast or conversation. But to address your question more directly, I'm not sure how recent those studies are that talk about the 25% of people with mental health diagnosis having a police history or arrest history. But based on my personal experiences, right, and the colleagues around me, I would venture to say that that's very low. And I will venture to say that the number is even lower because a lot of it is not reported. What I can certainly say is that there is not a public defender anywhere in this country without a caseload that includes clients who have mental health diagnosis. And it's probably a significant number. I mean, we would easily say anywhere from 2 out of 4, right? Or even 3 out of 4, but definitely not just the one. The problem is pervasive, right? But the bigger problem in the criminal justice system is not the criminalization of mental illness, but it is the fact that the criminal legal system equates mental illness with dangerousness and violence. Wow. And they do it consistently. And it's because of that association, it means that a public defender who wakes up and walks into a first appearance bond hearing with a client and they're preparing to have a hearing, they have to make a decision, right? If you have a client that's manifesting some symptoms, even though you haven't confirmed them, manifesting some symptoms of a mental illness, you have to decide real time, am I going to raise this issue now? Because you know that if I say something at this moment, it's going to probably prohibit this person from getting a bond because a court will find them a danger to themselves or a danger to their communities. It is probably going to slow down their process because now doctors, social workers, case managers, therapists, and others have to be involved so that we can truly evaluate what their circumstance is. Right. And the problem is, if you don't say anything, then in some ways, you know that you are delaying access to treatment. But sometimes you decide, maybe I won't say anything just yet, right? Maybe what I'm going to do in this moment is advocate for this person's release because I know that is harmful, that a jail is not a mental health facility and that they need to be released. And then you go and work with social workers, family members, and whomever you can to try and help them get access to treatment once they are released in custody. But that same consideration bleeds over, not just in a first appearance hearing, but in every stage of the process. If you have to have a motions hearing, well, they have to, provide feedback and they have to understand and appreciate the circumstances. Sentencing hearings at a trial stage, at every stage of the process, public defenders are having to decide at what point do I raise this issue? Because in the criminal legal system, it has negative impacts and consequences for those people who are charged with crimes. And it also means once you know, it also means that they end up having to answer a set of questions that no one else who comes to the criminal legal system has to answer, right? And so it becomes very invasive and borderline offensive, the degree to which we have to make others feel comfortable with those clients being released. And you know that so we see it every single day, and we are constantly making judgment calls about how and when to address it, and trying to balance when it is appropriate to raise those issues, or whether we might, you know, consider taking an alternative route to getting them community resources and treatment.
Such an important point.
And it just sounds to me that the system isn't equipped to handle this. If you as public defenders have to make a decision, right, about a client who clearly has some difficulty, and what in that decision is a detriment, it delays their service. So what improvements, like if you had to say your one, and I know it's wishful thinking because the criminal legal system has a whole lot of work that needs to be done, but what improvement would you say is the number one thing that we need to do? Right? What is to have compassion for the people that you're serving? What is the biggest, I guess, hurdle that you think needs to be adjusted in this system as it relates to mental health?
So I'm gonna cheat a little bit, Elliot. I'm just gonna say both education and awareness, as well as resources. So it's not one, but it's all in one sentence. Right? I mean, and that's honestly what I believe. I think the more compassionate, the more education you do with the parties who are part of the criminal legal process, the more aware they are. So for example, you've got to increase pre-arrest diversion type programs where rather than having a police officer in full uniform with a gun show up, that call is triaged to a law enforcement officer who's been trained on mental health intervention and maybe shows up in street clothes, you know, with an EMT, right? Those kinds of programs I think are critical. And the other thing is, I think the court system, the judges and the prosecutors especially, have to stop punishing people for having diagnosis. And I don't just mean locking them up. I mean adding to their sentences harsher conditions, right? Just because they have a diagnosis. And so that, you know, and they're already struggling, it often results in a revolving door. And people are trying to maneuver circumstances that are just not possible until they have the proper treatment that they need.
Yeah. So
can I jump in for a quick second? This is
Of course, Shanti.
If you don't mind. Thank you, sister, for those comments. They were so on point. I just want to echo that. And we're on a podcast, so you know, I try not to get emotional about this stuff, but like it's so frustrating, right? Being a mental health advocate, and every time something bad happens, you know, they want to blame it on the news on mental health, right? And so maybe someone was struggling. But oftentimes, if you talk to people who work in mental health, and I'm sure Dr. Alfie, you know, may be able to provide some insight, but oftentimes people who commit crimes, you know, they don't commit crimes towards strangers, right? It's usually towards the people that are closest to them. And if you've ever experienced a loved one with a severe mental illness, they tend to act out towards people close to them, but they're just not out, you know, on the prowl looking for people to rob and steal and kill, right? So I'm tired of us as a nation blaming everything on mental health, right? Because I just don't think that's a fair assessment that a lot of people in the press outlet, you know, they just take to the news and quickly blame it on mental health. The other thing is, yes, we do need to continue more education and awareness. So just like Gideon's Promise, you know, does these incredible trainings to train public defenders to better serve marginalized communities, you know, I'd love to see Gideon's Promise come together and partner with Silence to Shame, because we just implemented these trainings called the Soundtrack of Mental Health. So we're going back into the entertainment industry to provide wellness trainings. And then we're going to go into sports and do it under the umbrella of, you know, another kind of sports branding. But maybe we can brand it so that we're training public defenders as well as we continue to, you know, raise more funds to be able to do it. But my point is, you do have to continue to educate, right? You got to learn about the signs and symptoms of mental illness and what it looks like, how to treat it, And, I was just looking at the news about a week ago, and shout out to New York City, because no longer, if you call 911 and say that you have someone who is in crisis that might be going through a psychotic break or through psychosis, they're not going to send the police anymore. And they're actually going to send, they have like a mental health crisis team now. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes people don't have a choice in other cities. And so if you do call the police or the authorities, you should ask for a CIT trained officer, which stands for Crisis in Training. It's just so much more that needs to happen. And, from a public defender standpoint, just normal policing and mental health, once the people, if the individuals are incarcerated, and what does that look like? Because from a rehabilitation standpoint, oftentimes there is no real mental health plan or treatment there. So it's so much work to be done, but that's why conversations like this are so important. And I commend Gideon's Promise for doing this episode around mental health and wellness and criminal justice. But let's keep this going even outside of May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month, because we got to train, we got to build more compassion, and we got to educate folks as well.
And I'm going to say, Shanti, thank you for telling our listeners what to say, and who to ask for when something happens. So just coincidentally,
I was just thinking of this.
I know, because we've been married too long, Rap. But recently, we came home 9:30 at night after a long day of lacrosse with our son, and there was a woman on our front porch pacing. It was cold. Looks like she had just been released from the emergency room. She had on thin hospital gear. She's pacing and mumbling, and we couldn't understand. And she was clearly in crisis. Mm. And because of what we do and who we serve, we didn't want to call 911 because we didn't want her to be arrested. She clearly needed support, or worse, right? And so we called a former public defender who does a lot of community organizing. And she was actually on the show a couple of months ago, Tiffany Williams Roberts with the Southern Center for Human Rights, and said, I'm sorry it's late. This is what's happening. What do I tell 911? They first said call 311 in Atlanta. They didn't pick up. I got to call. She's in crisis. She told us what to say so that they did send an EMT. There weren't lights flashing to trigger her. We, Rap got her a blanket because it was freezing, and just the level of empathy. And so I knew that. I didn't even know that information. And we work and live in the communities we serve. So I thank you for telling people that CIT and what to do and what you can say to protect people.
And I have to just add, I appreciate you telling our audience that information. What was so frustrating about that experience was, even when we got that information, it took 30 minutes to get someone to respond. And in the meantime, they called the police, who showed up in 5 minutes. So it's so much, the only response we have to people who don't have means, who are in crisis, is a response of force with law enforcement, who just aren't trained to handle these anyway, except with force. It's really something. And that really brings me, Dr. Alfie, to a question I have for you, because having worked in the criminal legal system for a long time, it's clear to me that the criminal legal system itself is a source of trauma. It's a source of trauma visited upon everyone in the system, not just those accused, but their loved ones, their families, their children. And we know the statistics that the criminal legal system disproportionately impacts people of color. If you are Black, you are 6 times more likely to be thrown into the criminal legal system than a similarly situated white person. If you are Black, sentences, studies have shown, are 19 times as lengthy as those for similarly situated white people. I actually don't think we can talk about the trauma on Black and brown communities without talking about mass incarceration. And I really would just love to hear your thoughts about that, and what you think, how you think we respond.
So I think that obviously it's a great question. It clearly impacts those of us who are Black and of color in very significant ways. So I think part of my response has to do with how we can't ignore that the same stigma that exists in society around mental illness exists in these different systems. So my training is as a mental health services researcher, and mental health services really is just every sector that can intersect with mental health. We look at all those sectors. So it's human services, it's legal, it's medicine, it's all of that, it's education. And I think with that said, what I struggle with is we have these entrees towards solutions like mental health court. We were writing about mental health court years ago. I don't know, probably like 8 or 9 years, maybe 10 years ago. One of my students and I wrote a paper on it for a psychiatric nursing journal. And, you know, there still are not a lot of those around. The one that we looked at, I think, was in San Diego, but I think it was a Latino judge who had brought this idea up and tried to implement it. And I'm thinking in part because of probably his own personal background, right? Being Latinx, and the intersection between his ethnicity, what that means for the justice system, and, you know, working with people who have mental illness. So it's a great question because it's so relevant and centered for those of us who are from these communities, or those of us, I like to say, who love people who are from these communities, right? So I think about de Blasio, and I think about, we happen to know the grandson of Senator Leahy from Vermont. I'm from Vermont. I'm sorry, Lamont, from Vermont. Our kids used to play basketball together. And so I know that part of his understanding is having his biracial grandbaby, right? Just like de Blasio as a white man, that may not be his individual experience, but it affects the child that he loves. And so I'm always grateful for people who really try to center and come from that lens. One thing I do want to highlight is that when we talk about the intersection between violent acts, let's just stick with that one tiny piece, and people who do have mental illness, it's less than 10% of these big violent crimes are committed by people who have these illnesses. On top of that, it's not everybody with a mental illness, right? And so often it is people who are in the throes of a severe and persistent mental illness. They're having, as Shanti said earlier, a break from reality, and these things are happening. So it's not everybody on the full spectrum of all people who have mental illnesses. So I think often when people think about mental illness, they think of two things, right? We don't use the word crazy to describe people in my family. My kids are 16 and 14. They've been hearing that since they could hear. You can say a situation is crazy, things are wild, things like that, but you never call people crazy. But I think that's the perception that we have. There's a dichotomy. Either you're severely mental ill or there's no mental illness. And we don't think about it's a continuum. And we're all there at some point experiencing something somewhere along that continuum. So when I think about, just how do we begin to address these things, everything that you all have said is quite relevant for me. So I know there's one representative, I think it's DeFazio, who has put forth something called the Cahoots Bill. And in the Cahoots Bill, what they're advocating for is these mobile units, and they're mental health mobile units. So when you call for help, to you all's point, it's not just the police, it's trained police and it's mental health professionals who are going out and doing these things. To also, going back to the example that Shanti shared earlier. And so the trauma often for people is that we know, to your example that you just gave, if you have a person of color, the more identities you add, the more worried people are going to be, who also happens to have a racial identity that's marginalized and who has, a mental illness. Then we are afraid with good reason to call in traditional forms of law enforcement. And so what I want people to understand is that doesn't come out of nowhere. That comes out of a history and a reality of you're already put upon because of other people's racism. I hesitate to say that they do these things because I'm Black. They don't do it because I'm Black, right? I can't change. This is beautiful. I don't want to change this. They do it because they have racist attitudes. So that's what I always like people to hear. Don't own that. They didn't pick on you or treat you bad because you're Black or you're a woman or you're gay. They did it because they're homophobic, sexist, racist, name all the other labels. And I think those isms are, right within law enforcement and other social service agencies. So, people's experience of not wanting to engage police is real. And what we have to think about is how do we bring advocates like those of us on the phone, legal folks like my colleague Zanelli here to the table, and the work that you do, how do we bring all those entities to the table so that you all can educate law enforcement about what is needed? They need to hear everything Sister Zanelli said about all the decision points that they have to go through in the system helping people who have mental illness. And I think if people can hear that along with the trauma, like really listen, those are the things that will, I think, lead people to do better about how we treat people with mental illness in the context of the criminal justice system, and people won't continue to be traumatized. But we're a long way away from that. I do have to say that.
And so it sounds like, one of the things that Gideon's Promise is big on promoting is narrative change, right? Is changing the narrative about the people our public defenders serve. So changing the narrative people who have mental health challenges, watching language. And I always tell people, correct me if I'm not saying it right. And so Shanti, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, society is getting better talking about mental health. I think the pandemic of 2020 that is continues to roll into 2021, people are starting to have conversations of what is going to happen to all of us, especially our children, right, who have been in isolation for a while. People, because of health challenges, could not and still cannot be out. So people are starting to talk. I'm hearing the buzz more. But in the Black community, mental health is stigmatized. And my question to you is, we're doing this podcast. We have Dr. Alfie. Is what steps do we need to take to address the stigma about what Dr. Alfie said in the beginning? We just didn't talk about that. We're starting now, but I still hear things where, no, it's okay. Pray it away, breathe on it, go for a walk, which actually can be wellness. But how do we reduce the stigma? How do we address it in the Black and Brown communities, that it's okay to talk about this and get help?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, we are doing it, right? We're normalizing this conversation through podcasts like this. But I really think it starts like in your own home, right? Just the basic conversation that you have around the dinner table. It's got to be red table talk in your own home. Not just on social media. It's got to be at the crib, with, mama and big mama and them and your cousin Jimmy and Auntie Jane and, everybody. We've got to especially get our older generation to be okay with talking to it. That's why, like at Silence the Shame, we've been going back into communities, into churches, and really starting those conversations, right? Meeting people where they're at. So that a large segment of the African-American population, especially the senior community, they still go to church, or they're there virtually now with the pandemic. And so really shaping those narratives and opening up those conversations. Like a couple years ago, we started what's called Silence the Shame Sunday. Churches could pick any Sunday in the month of May to start opening up these conversations. And I'll never forget, after church, I was, in the lobby of the church passing out, materials and resources. And it was really interesting because I'm not a psychologist like Dr. Alfie, but I've learned over the years through friends and what I do, I watch body language and people's languages. And it was so interesting how some of the senior people came up to me, like almost like, okay, let me grab one of those. So what you got going on here? They knew that I was the same lady, the mental health lady, but they really didn't want nobody to see them coming up to me to get those resources. So fast forward, I'm proud to say that this year, Ebenezer, which is my church, they did a mental health awareness Sunday. And so me sharing my story initially in the pulpit started to open up those doors. So having those community conversations within the churches, also talking to your teens and your young adults. We partner with Jack and Jill of America, and also we've done work with the Boys and Girls Club. So we've got to incorporate wellness in these conversations with the teens and create safe spaces for them to talk about it. Because I noticed, when you try to do large forums with the teens, they kind of, clam up or don't really want to talk about it. But if you have smaller group settings and conversations, they're a little bit more open to sharing their feelings. And the pandemic really did a number on our young folks, because you got to remember it was 2 pandemics, right? So now you're a young person who, school was cut short. You might have not had prom last year, or if you graduated, you didn't have a real celebration. So you add that on top of being Black, right, for Black teens, and being afraid of the police, and especially Black males, and honestly, Black males and females, right? Because we've been seeing the injustice done, for both males and females in the African-American community. So starting that, so really, again, making it a part of the everyday vernacular, if you will, in Black culture so we can talk about it. Also knowing, continuing to understand that words matter. You know, we throw around the crazy word, you know, and I fall victim to it, not in terms of from a mental health perspective, but it's just a word. Oh, that was crazy. You know, we just use that word a lot in Black culture and pop culture. So trying to do away with that word and trying to also make sure that we see things more through a lens of empathy and sympathy. Because especially with social media, you know, we're so quick to feel sorry for somebody. We don't need you to feel sorry for us. We just need you to understand where we're at. So being able to have these conversations and coming more from a place of compassion, right, as opposed to sympathy. And then when you do get this information, right, because one thing I've learned too, that we might do a session with teens, but then they go back home, and if they lived in marginalized communities or underserved communities, if the parents don't get it, then, you know, we have to go back and start all over again. So we as a community have to get our siblings and parents to be open to these conversations. So if one person in the family learns it, then your responsibility is to go back into your village and share that information and not, you know, keep it close to you. So we've got to do that. And then lastly, I'll just say I coined this new acronym called RAP. That wouldn't be John rapping though.
I love it. I love it.
RAP. So I tell people now, like, when you're not sure about these unfamiliar feelings, first you got to recognize them, right? The R in RAP is recognizing those feelings that are unfamiliar and you don't really know where to put those feelings. But once you recognize them, you got to acknowledge it and really accept it, because you can recognize something within yourself that is like, oh, did I just do that? Or what was that? But we get embarrassed about it and we don't want to acknowledge that it happened and don't want to accept the fact that it happened, to then take you to the P in RAP to process through it with a professional to really get the help. So recognize, acknowledge, accept, and process it through it with a professional. And that should be something that every single person in the Black community knows, that it's okay not to be okay, but you got to take those steps so you can get the help that you need and be whole again.
Well, you know, Shanti.
RAP, rapping, RAP.
Well, you know,
I'll never
Shanti,
forget it.
I could say that marketing hat that you wore for years is still right over, and
Right.
and you transferable skills. We talk about that, and I love when we have episodes where people can take some concrete tools away. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I do want to bring it back to Zanelli real quick, because you know, I know when you're working in the criminal legal system, rather than deal with human beings in crisis, it's easier to become indifferent. It's easier to become cruel. It's easier to see people as less than human. And when you work in that system every day, it does violence to your own spirit. I think one thing we see happen to so many people in the criminal legal system, and certainly public defenders, is the most passionate, empathetic public defenders over time have that spirit beaten out of them. And some of them quit. Some of them actually become indifferent themselves. Zanelli, you've now been doing this for 14 years and somehow have managed to neither quit nor lose your empathy and your spirit. And because you have been a part of Gideon's Promise for so long, I feel like I can't let you leave without asking you, what has this community meant to you? How has Gideon's Promise helped you sort of survive these 14 years, excel in these 14 years?
So I really feel like that's a personal question, but, and I joke, but I say that sincerely, because honestly, I think the response to that is a story that probably you nor Illy have ever heard, right? Early on in my career, I used to tell public defenders all the time, you know, check your burnout level. I used to try to encourage them in the fight. And one of the tools or strategies that I would give would be, listen, every now and then, I need you to review your entire active caseload. And when you do that, as long as you can put a face with every name on your caseload, you might be doing okay, right? You at least know that you are checked into the fact that you have human beings that you're responsible for. What I didn't plan for in that conversation, and the part that I think I have learned and grown to understand over time, is that eventually you will recognize those faces and then you'll start recognizing the families. behind those faces. And then you'll memorize the phone calls of those families of those faces. And what happens is, or at least what happened to me, was that started to be very heavy. That became very triggering for me. And by and large, right, I was doing client-centered representation. I was serving my people, but my telephone would ring and I would recognize the number and I would let it ring once or twice because I knew that that was going to be a mother crying on the other line. And I had to take a couple of breaths and get myself together before I could give her space to have whatever conversation she needed to have with me in that moment. And it also would manifest in other random ways. I would walk into hospitals for one reason or another and immediately have a physical reaction to the smell, because hospitals often smell like jails. It's a stench, it's a sterilizing stench that they use to clean those spaces. And it just reminds me of like sickness and being surrounded by sickness and feeling, you know, the overwhelming pressure to try to help people in ways that I can't always touch them. And so that eventually, my leg is shaking. In any event, that eventually did started to have an effect on my physical health, right? And during the time that I was a public defender, I mean, I gained a significant amount of weight, right? I started losing my gorgeous Afro locks, right? Which I love and hold dear. And other things. I mean, at one point I was seeing my primary doctor, a hematologist, a orthopedic doctor, a physical therapist. I mean, at one point I even ended up in a neurologist's office because I realized that my physical body wasn't functioning or responding in a healthy way. And so for me, Gideon's Promise came into play because it was the one place, you know, nobody knows or understands what it's like to be a caring public defender more than this community. Nobody. And I knew that when I would go to Gideon's Promise every 6 months, I would walk away feeling better. And so I walked into a session. This honestly was about 4 years ago. So it's fully 10 years into my practice that by and large has gone relatively well. And I'm proud of it. I walked into a Gideon's Promise weekend knowing, but not saying to anyone, that I needed a lifeline, right? Like your girl was hurting. And I just remember that weekend going through the sessions and thinking to myself, I don't want to hear about another code. I don't want to hear a thing about a constitution or a thing about a cross-examination. All I need right now is to be around a compassionate community of defenders who can give me energy, right? Because I knew that I could at least get that in Gideon's Promise. So we had a list of sessions that weekend, and it happened to be a weekend that Lori, one of our Gideon's Promise faculty, was doing a session on burnout. And I'll tell you, it was crazy because I was so ashamed to go to this session. And so everybody always asks, where are you going? Where are you going? And I you know, I'm sure I told them, I don't know, I'm trying to decide between 2 or 3 things. But 60 seconds into it started, and I like rushed into the room where she was, because I didn't really want to see anybody there. I felt a little guilty. I was a little embarrassed, especially for me, someone who's generally very encouraging to others who are in this fight with me, to be walking into this room feeling the way that I was. Lori started talking about a thing called vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. And I remember feeling immediately relieved, like weights were just falling off of me, because I could then name and pinpoint exactly what I was experiencing. And it was the first time, I mean, it was a game changer for me in terms of staying in this fight, because I knew what it was called, right? I wasn't just crazy. My body wasn't going crazy on me. I was physically responding to the trauma that I was reliving with other people through the work every single day. And so from that moment, I started to do research on it to just really understand it. It helped me connect more even with my clients who had mental illnesses. And what I've learned in those 4 years, really and truly, is that my triggers haven't changed very much. But what Gideon's Promise has taught me or provided me is some tools to continue to do the work and to be successful. And so what I've learned is that I've got to do what they tell you to do on the airplane, right? They always tell you to put your mask on before you can help those most vulnerable put their mask on. And so for me, Gideon's Promise has always been my oxygen mask, and I have to show up every 6 months if I'm going to keep breathing and continuing to be successful in this work.
Oh my God.
I know Dr. Alfie is like, so Dr. Alfie, is she doing everything you could have
I was
advised?
losing it. She got all the buzzwords. She, like, I'm freaking losing it. Zanelli, like, so I have to call out vicarious trauma. I have to call out something called allostatic load, which I'll explain super quickly. I have to call out chronic stress. And I have to call out what we've been talking about, this thing, trauma, right? Trauma is an emotional response to a negative event. It is literally that simple. And, you know, we have all these different terms and ways that we think about it, but trauma is acute, right? In the moment, it's short. It can be chronic when you're continually exposed and it's not managed, and it can be complex, right? And so everything that you just said, that allostatic load, that is your endocrine system, that's your neural system. It gets on overload, right? And it just wears on you. And so all those things you were describing, like you were describing like acute and chronic stress responses. You walk into the hospital, the smell hits you, it triggers something in you, and you don't even necessarily know why, but you labeled it. So I was like sitting here jumping out of my seat because I was like, oh my God, she's hitting out, like she's naming all of it. And so, you know, the most important thing to me is that you said that you found ways to take care of yourself, and you found a community to help give you some tools for you to take care of yourself. And you didn't say anything about going to a mental health professional. I think that's fine, right? For some people, they don't ever get to that point. They may not ever go when we think about elders and some other folks in our community, but you have to do something. So what you described is what I always tell my patients: you need a toolkit with a whole bunch of stuff in it. And the first thing you need in the toolkit is, remember them labeling machines back in the day? You need the labeling machine to label all that stuff you're dealing with. So once you label it, right, like we talk about in all the anonymous programs, you can't address it until you name it. So I just love everything that you said. So I have to say quickly, there's this other concept called weathering, which is basically your body getting eaten up from the inside out from the overexposure to stress and trauma. It started just around maternal health, but it has expanded to include all these other things. And then I did explain briefly allostatic load. And then I just want to call out the vicarious trauma thing, because it started with people in the helping professions, but now we can apply it pretty much to anybody. So you can witness it and have almost the same responses to you having experiences. So Zanelli, you the queen. Thank you for like naming all of that stuff. I just bless you.
Wow. So first of all, the fact that Dr. Alfie just ran it down for us, I think, first of all, Dr. Alfie, we have to have you come to our Gideon's Promise to work with Lori James Towns, who does a lot of work on wellness, and some of our other faculty who really told us we needed to incorporate wellness in our programming. And we've done it, like Zanelli said, the last few years. First of all, I want to thank you all. We have to wrap up. We can be on this podcast for 2 more hours.
I know.
I want to thank Zanelli and Gubani. If you want to meet Zanelli when we go back live, she is in Full Count, Georgia now. She will be a faculty trainer at our conference that will be January 2022 in Atlanta. Dr. Alfie has a weekly podcast called Couch in Color, so you can check her out and her esteemed guest.
And Dr. Alfie, are there ways that people can stay on top of what you're doing?
Yes, so it's pretty straightforward, and it's Dr. Alfie. It looks like Drouthy. That's what my son's friends call me, Drouthy. But Drouthy.com, which is also the same as my handle across pretty much every social. I'm even on TikTok. And then my nonprofit, which focuses primarily on young people of color through young adults and marginalized young people, is a COMA project. AA, K as in kite, OMA. Project. That's all one word. Website, Instagram, Twitter, all that other good stuff. And you already mentioned the podcast, so thank you.
All right.
And Shanti Das, Silence the Shame, also has a podcast. And last week they just had their first big gala, virtually a Brilliant Mind Gala, which they will have annually. So please support her organization just as much as you support ours.
Shanti, could you let the audience know how they can follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to let them know how they can follow the organization. So you can check out www.silencetheshame.com. We have a resource tab with links to some amazing organizations around emotional health and wellness. Because I think a lot of people often say, I don't even know where to find a therapist or how to find a psychiatrist. So we have, a lot of great resources on silencetheshame.com, and you can follow us on IG, Instagram @silencetheshame, and on Facebook and Twitter @silencethshame. And then you can follow me at Shanti Das 404.
I want to thank this all-woman panel. We have another follow-up at the end of this month, closing out Mental Health Month, Awareness Month, with an all-Black male panel coming up to talk about this very topic. So I thank you all, and just in true former fashion, I am Ilham Askia.
And I am Jonathan Rapping.
Wrapping it up.
Hey, Il, before we hit that outro, why don't you tell people how to order a copy of the book in your radio voice?
In my radio voice?
Yeah, in your radio voice.
Okay. Get your copy of Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice at Amazon, IndieBound, Beacon Press, or wherever books are sold. Pre-order today, and a portion of proceeds will help us support public defenders.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast, with Jonathan Rapping. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.